The brass stable key lay in the straw between my bare foot and the open hand Kellen Moonridge refused to close. Rainwater slid from my short hair and down the back of my neck. My bridal veil had torn somewhere between the chapel door and the old stable, and the remaining pins pulled at my scalp like tiny offended teeth. White silk clung to my knees in wet folds, streaked with mud, candle soot, and one long smear of blood that was not mine. Naturally, the first thing I noticed was the hem. 16 yards of Brackenholt bridal silk, imported on credit, embroidered by women with better posture than mine, and I had dragged it through rain, straw, and the dead remains of a wedding. Lady Isolde would have called it a disgrace. Lord Alaric Vane, had he still possessed a throat suited to comment, would have called it evidence. Kellen stood by the stable door, not in front of it. That was the detail that made my chest go tight. He was bleeding through his torn linen shirt. Silver burns scored the lean muscle along his ribs, and his deep brown hair was wet enough to curl at his temples. His blue eyes were too bright for lantern light. They had been too bright in rain before, under trees, above hounds gone silent. I knew better now. I knew a great many things I had spent years refusing to know. Outside, fresh wolf tracks darkened the mud beyond the threshold. Inside, the key waited.
Road,
Kellen said. His voice was rough but not pleading. He had never been good at pleading.
house, empty chapel. Me.
I looked at his hand, then at the key, then at the ruined strip of silk wound around my fingers. My knees still shook from the chapel. My mouth, treacherous thing, wanted to make a joke. Something about unsuitable wedding gifts. Something about how most brides received pearls, not murder. Instead, I said,
How generous. A key, along with the comfort of pretending I chose the cage myself. You do love arranging my exits.
For once, he did not smile.
I left it because I needed to know.
That was the terrible thing about Kellen. Even when he lied, he left one true thing where I could touch it. The story did not begin with that key, though I have tried to make it begin there. It is cleaner to say a woman made one choice in a stable after blood and rain. It sounds almost respectable if one says it quickly enough. No, it began at breakfast with a spoon, a creditor, and the humiliating price of my hair. Chapter 1. The orchard fence and the mud on the wrong boots. Silas Crow had a way of looking at furniture as if calculating how it might be taken apart and sold by weight. That morning, in the long breakfast room, his gaze moved from the tarnished sugar tongs to the cracked gilt mirror, from the mirror to the damp patch blooming in the ceiling plaster, and finally to me. I was 23 years old enough to be called past managing by women who had never climbed anything higher than a staircase, and apparently still young enough to be described while present.
The hair helps,
Mr. Crow said. My mother, Lady Isolde Brackenholt, went very still at the head of the table.
I beg your pardon,
she said. He did not look embarrassed. Men like Mr. Crow never did. They dressed insult in valuation and called themselves practical.
Lady Honoria's hair.
He said, nodding toward me.
Uncommon shade. Very fine. Platinum, isn't it? That sort of distinction can soften a gentleman's view of temperament, depending on the gentleman.
I touched the ends of it where they brushed my neck. Straight, center-parted, and too short for proper pins, according to every maid who had ever tried to make me look marriageable. I had cut it myself 2 winters before, with embroidery scissors, after a visiting earl told me women with long hair looked more biddable from behind. The cut had not improved my prospects. It had improved my temper enormously.
How fortunate that my skull has made itself useful to the household.
Lady Isolde's fingers tightened around her teacup. Her face, narrow and powdered and controlled into fine lines, flickered with something almost like defense. Then Mr. Crow placed a folded paper beside her plate and named the debt aloud. The room changed around the number. Rain tapped at the tall windows. The breakfast silver looked colder. My cousin Corvin, sitting 2 chairs down, stopped buttering toast with the injured patience of a man who had spent years cleaning mud from scandals he did not get to enjoy. At the sideboard, Mabel Rose Needle paused in the cuff she was mending. Even she had heard it. Lady Isolde lowered her eyes to the paper. That was the first sale of the morning. I smiled at Mr. Crow so sweetly that Corvin glanced up in alarm.
Do you suppose my temper lowers or raises the value? I should hate to mismanage an asset.
Honoria.
No, truly. I could bite someone before luncheon if that would help the accounts.
Mr. Crow's mouth thinned.
A spirited girl can be settled. The right husband understands correction.
My hand moved before my temper could improve the family finances. The spoon beside my porridge slipped neatly from the table, struck the rim of Mr. Crow's cup, and tipped hot tea into his lap. He shot to his feet with a noise no creditor should make before breakfast.
Oh?
I said, already standing.
How clumsy of the spoon.
Lady Weiseld called my name twice. I heard the first one in the corridor and the second while I was halfway through the morning room window. The house had rules about doors. Doors had handles, witnesses, and people waiting on the other side with lectures. Windows had ivy, a stone ledge, and a short drop into wet grass if one knew where to put a boot. I landed badly in the rose bed, cursed into a shrub, and ran for the orchard fence in a half-laced morning dress, the color of pale butter. The hem caught twice. I tore it free both times. My pearl earring fell somewhere near the kitchen garden. I let Brackenholt keep that one. The house had already taken enough. The orchard fence was older than my father's portrait and less likely to shout. I climbed it with wet hands, one knee hooked over the top rail, skirts bunched indecently high, and came face to face with Kellen Moonridge, waiting beneath the apple tree on the other side. Ashmain stood beside him, saddled and deeply unimpressed with everyone. Kellen had the reins looped over one wrist. His linen shirt was open at the throat, his sleeves rolled, his dark hair damp from the same miserable dawn that had flattened mine against my jaw. His blue eyes moved from my torn hem to the mud on my knee to the boot I had managed to lace wrong. He bowed, not properly. Kellen's bows always contained enough obedience to survive inspection and enough mockery to deserve punishment.
My lady.
I nearly fell off the fence. He caught me by the waist before I could land on my face, lifted me down as if I weighed no more than a saddle blanket and set me in the grass. His hands left at once. They always did back then. That was part of why I trusted them.
You always guess wrong.
I snapped because gratitude was for people whose bodices were closed.
I only have to guess you.
Typical. No straight answer from you.
It has been working beautifully for 11 years.
I snatched the reins.
Did you saddle her because you enjoy being dismissed?
No. I saddled her because you wore the left boot with the repaired heel, which means you intended to take the north paddock path. You also removed 3 hairpins and left mud on the lower latch of your window. Had you planned the east gate, you would have taken gloves. Had you planned the stream wall, you would have stolen trousers from the laundry and scandalized God before breakfast. I know you so well, it has stopped becoming funny.
You watch my window latch?
Only when the house starts discussing your market value over eggs.
That stole my next insult. I hated when Kellen did that. He could take a room apart with a practical sentence and leave me holding my temper like a useless glove. From the house came the first shout. Kellen looked past me.
We have about 3 minutes before your mother reaches the orchard. 5 if Mr. Crow's dignity requires changing.
His dignity will require burning.
Good. 5 then.
I put my foot in the stirrup. Ashmain shifted beneath me, eager and difficult, her black coat shining blue under the wet leaves. Kellen's hand hovered near my boot, ready if I slipped, not touching unless disaster made it necessary. That was another thing I loved before I knew what to call it. He understood the difference between help and humiliation. Or I thought he did. Lady Isolde arrived with Corvin and 2 servants breathless behind her. Mr. Crow limped at a furious distance, one gloved hand held in front of his damp trousers, as if modesty had become a wound.
Honoria Brackenholt.
Get down from that horse.
I'd rather not. She seems more reasonable than anyone in the dining room.
Mr. Crow looked at Ashmain. Ashmain showed him her teeth. Kellen stepped forward with the servant smile that should have fooled no one and fooled everyone far too often.
Begging your pardon, my lady. The mare spooked at the loose gate. Lady Honoria went after her before she could bolt toward the road. The gardener had been at cider early from the look of him, and the fence rail gave under the strain. Her dress made a brave attempt at suicide.
There were at least 5 lies in that statement, and one deeply unfair accusation against a gardener who had been dead since Michaelmas. Mabel coughed into her sleeve. Lady Isolde stared at Kellen.
The gardener?
Terrible habit, drank.
Kellen said gravely.
Pharaoh dismissed the gardener.
That explains the poor workmanship at the gate.
I made a strangled sound that I disguised as concern for Ashmain. The servants accepted the lie with alarming speed. One footman had opened his mouth to object. Kellen's eyes moved to him, not sharply, not even rudely, and the man lowered his chin as if remembering an order given by someone much higher than a stable hand. Even Corvin looked tired enough to let it stand, though his eyes narrowed at the mare's perfect saddle. Lady Isolde's gaze found the torn bodice ribbon hanging loose near my waist. For 1 second her hand lifted, not to strike me, not to seize me, but to cover me from Mr. Crow's eyes. Then Mr. Crow said,
The Vane settlement will not tolerate repeated public disorder.
My mother's hand dropped. I laughed because the alternative was climbing down and doing something worse than spoonwork. Kellen adjusted Ashmain's saddle strap. His fingers brushed the torn ribbon at my bodice, and when he drew his hand away, the ribbon was gone. I noticed because I noticed his hands. I always had. I decided he had tucked it away to prevent scandal. Keeping it would have meant noticing me too carefully, and I was not ready to accuse him of that yet. Then I saw the mud on his boots. Not orchard mud, not the thick, pale muck from beneath the apple trees. This was dark, streaked with black leaf rot from the lower path by the debt road, a path I had not taken. He had been somewhere else before waiting for me.
Ride,
he said softly. So I did. I rode away laughing, my torn dress whipping around my knees, wet air on my face, Ashmain's hooves tearing up the grass. Halfway to the north paddock, I glanced back. Kellen stood where I had left him, wiping mud from the wrong side of his boots. Luck, I named it. At Brackenholt, that was the safest name for kindness before it came with a bill. Chapter 2. The Accidents That Stopped Being Funny. After Mr. Crow began saying my hair helped, suitors came in groups, as if Brackenholt had become a public stable, and I was a difficult mare to be inspected before purchase. They came with riding boots, family pins, lavender gloves, weak chins, strong opinions, and the shared conviction that women were improved by marriage in the way fields were improved by fencing. The first one made the mistake of asking whether I could be trained out of climbing.
Not cheaply,
I said. He laughed. No man should laugh at his own future injury. His name has escaped me, which is rude because his fall was memorable. He had insisted on a staged ride around the paddock to demonstrate what he called firm handling. Ashmain was not invited. Kellen selected a placid bay gelding with a moral expression and a girth that apparently had lost its will to live. The suitor mounted, adjusted his cuffs, announced that spirited wives were like spirited horses, and landed face first in the mud before completing the comparison. I laughed so hard I had to sit on a rain barrel. Kellen, beside the fence, looked at the remaining straps with deep professional sadness.
Old leather.
That was cruel,
I said, still laughing.
The horse disagreed.
For a while, that was how it went. Men who praised obedience found themselves bitten, splashed, locked in garden sheds, or compelled to chase hats into dung heaps. Kellen never seemed to be involved. He only appeared afterward, with a towel, a lie, and eyes that did not quite meet mine when I smiled too brightly. It should have been obvious. A house can suffer many accidents, but accidents around one person acquire a shape. The shape sharpened in the wash yard. Mr. Crow had returned to press the settlement forward, and he found me alone by the pump, sleeves rolled, rinsing mud from my riding gloves. He stood too close, the silver buckles on his gloves flashing, when he braced one hand against the wall behind me.
Your family is doing its best. You make that difficult.
How shocking. I had hoped to make it impossible.
Lord Vane will enjoy that mouth for perhaps a week.
His gaze dropped, measured, and returned to my face.
After that, he will price silence higher.
The pump handle was cold under my wet fingers. I remember that because I have never liked admitting how still I went. Kellen appeared with a bucket in one hand and a servant's smile on his mouth.
Mr. Crow, Master Pharaoh asked for the West Stall account.
Later.
Now,
Kellen said, still smiling.
if you please.
Sunlight slid over the silver buckles on Mr. Crow's gloves. My mother's silhouette watched from an upstairs window. Two maids crossed the far side of the yard with linens. Kellen's gaze moved once to the witnesses, once to the silver, once to me. Then he bowed and stepped aside. Mr. Crow laughed under his breath.
Well trained, at least.
I should have said something sharp. I said nothing. That evening, Mr. Crow left Brackenholt with his right hand wrapped in linen, 3 fingers splinted, and a story about a stall door that had panicked in the presence of money. The iron latch on that stall had been bent inward, not outward, as if the door had closed around his fingers, with a man's patience rather than a horse's kick. When Lady Iseld demanded an explanation, Kellen opened his mouth. I spoke first.
Ashmain kicked the door. Mr. Crow was foolish enough to put his hand where she had already warned him not to.
From the passage, Mabel Rowe's eyes flicked up. Mr. Crow could not contradict me without admitting he had been near me alone. Kellen said nothing. Lady Wyseld looked relieved to have a lie with proper furniture around it. Mabel was questioned for leaving the washyard gate unlatched. Jory Fenn, one of the young grooms, was scolded for hanging the wrong lantern near the stall. Neither had done anything except exist close enough to a story I needed. That was the first time one of Kellen's accidents made me feel cold afterward. I almost repeated a prank on the next suitor. He had a beard like damp wool, and a fondness for saying girls of noble blood required discipline. I found the loose hinge on the parlor chair myself, and stood behind him with my hand over my mouth, waiting for comedy to restore my character. Then I saw Mabel standing near the tea tray, her fingers raw from mending a torn cuff, her eyes on the chair, already afraid of being blamed. I moved the chair before he sat. Kellen watched me from the door. Neither of us joked. Later that night, I went to the tack room to change out of another ruined dress. It had suffered an unfortunate disagreement with a rose trellis, a footman, and my refusal to attend embroidery hour. Kellen stood outside the half-open door with his back turned, as he had since I was old enough for people to start saying his presence was improper.
If you look,
I said, fumbling with the wet lacing.
I will tell Lady Isolde you have been teaching Ashmain to bite creditors.
She came talented.
You encourage her.
I try to encourage talent where I find it.
I smiled at the wall before I could stop myself. Behind me, leather creaked. I glanced over my shoulder. He was not looking. He stood with one hand wrapped around a bridle hook, knuckles pale, jaw set hard enough to cut. His eyes were fixed on the tack wall, as if the bridles had personally insulted him. A sensible woman would have felt safe. Most of me did. The rest kept watching his hand on the bent hook. When he left, the hook was bent out of shape. I touched the warped metal. Outside, Jory was being questioned again about the lantern. Mabel stood silent beside him, hands folded too tightly in her apron. I left the hook crooked on the wall. All night I kept remembering how calmly he had ruined it. Chapter 3. The Hunter Who Heard the Hounds Go Quiet. Lord Alaric Vane arrived in a grey carriage with silver fittings, 2 footmen, 4 hounds, and the expression of a man who had never been thrown into mud by old leather. He was handsome in the expensive, airless way of porcelain figurines one is not allowed to touch. Ash blonde hair brushed back, pale blue-gray eyes, a thin mouth that smiled without softening. His gloves were embroidered with silver thread fine enough to look decorative, until Kellen stepped into the yard, and all 4 hounds went silent. Not calm. Silent. Their heads lowered, their lips pulled back from their teeth. One whined so quietly I felt it in my own gums. Kellen stood by Ashmane's stall with a brush in one hand. His sleeves were rolled, his brown hair loose at his nape, his posture as ordinary as rain. He looked at the hounds once. They looked away.
Useful animals.
Nervous ones.
I said, his eyes moved over me. Not quickly, not rudely enough for anyone to object. That was his talent. He could make inspection look like manners.
Lady Honoria.
Unfortunately.
Corvin made a small pained sound behind me. Lord Vane smiled.
Your mother warned me you were amusing. Your cousin warned me you prefer windows when doors become crowded.
Behind him, Corvin suddenly found something fascinating in the gravel near his boot.
Did he? How generous. He usually calls it costly.
At dinner, I wore a black dress because Lady Yseld said ivory would make me look too much like a bride before papers were properly signed, and rose would make me look unserious. Black, apparently, made me look repentant. My short hair refused the pins and framed my face in pale, straight pieces. Lady Yseld's maid nearly cried trying to manage it. Lord Vane sat across from me, silver-threaded cuffs resting against white linen. The hounds lay under the table near his boots. Kellen served wine behind my mother's chair because Brackenholt enjoyed arranging humiliations as efficiently as flowers.
I understand you ride.
I understand you hunt. We all have vulgar hobbies.
Lady Yseld's hand closed around my wrist beneath the table. Her nails pressed through my glove. Lord Vane's smile held.
Wolfborn, when necessary. They trouble old boundaries.
Kellen poured wine without spilling a drop.
And do they appreciate your attention?
Wild things rarely appreciate discipline until after it saves them from themselves.
His hand crossed the table before I understood he meant to touch me. Gloved fingers lifted a lock of my hair where it had slipped against my cheek. The silver thread in his cuff caught the candlelight. My mother's hand tightened. For one breath, she looked as if she might stop him. Then Corvin murmured something about the settlement schedule, and Lady Yseld released my wrist. Kellen did not move. That was the only reason I noticed how badly he wanted to. His hand around the wine bottle had gone perfectly still. Lord Vane noticed too. That was when I began to dislike him properly. Not because he was cruel. Plenty of men were cruel and stupid with it. Lord Vane observed. He watched Kellen's jaw, the hound's silence, my eyes flicking once toward the door before I could stop them. Later, in the corridor outside the library, he caught me alone between 2 portraits of dead Brackenholt men who had all looked better in oils than they likely had in conversation. He kept a gentleman's distance and somehow made the corridor feel too narrow.
Every time you look for an exit, you look for him first. North Paddock, Orchard Fence, Foxgate when you're angry enough to mistake a trap for distance.
I pulled my glove tighter finger by finger.
Every time you speak, I look for one as well. Do not flatter yourself.
Calling it escape doesn't make it yours, Lady Honoria. Not when you look for him before you look for the door.
The insult landed because it had teeth. I laughed anyway.
You must be tired. Hunting strays all day, diagnosing women by candlelight after supper.
His gaze flicked to the stable yard visible through the window. Kellen stood below in the rain, speaking to Jory. No one had told him where I was. He had known. Lord Vane's smile returned.
I admire loyalty. I dislike mysteries.
How tragic for books everywhere.
I escaped him by walking very fast and not running until the 3rd turn of the corridor. That night, one of Lord Vane's men laughed near the stables and said the trick was to begin before the vows, while the girl still thought refusal had teeth. Another answered that fear did half a husband's work for him. Kellen heard. Of course he heard. He heard a dropped latch across a storm if it involved me. The man was found in the hay passage with his shoulder dislocated and his mouth too swollen for boasting. Lord Vane did not punish Kellen. He punished Jory. The young groom came to morning work with rope burns on one wrist and a bruise below his eye, apologizing to everyone before anyone asked. He had held the wrong lantern the night before. That was all. Wrong place, wrong light, wrong weakness. I found Kellen at the trough, scrubbing blood from his cuff in water gone pink.
Whose?
The troughs. It started it.
Kellen?
He wrung the cloth out. His hands were cut at the knuckles.
You should be inside.
That is exactly the sort of sentence men say shortly before I make their lives worse.
Your talent remains reliable.
I wanted to ask about the injured man. I wanted to ask about Jory. I wanted to ask why the hounds feared him, and why Lord Vane looked at him as if a hunt had finally become interesting. Instead, I took the cloth from his hand and cleaned the blood he had missed near his wrist. He watched my fingers.
You should not do that.
Probably not, but I have done 3 unsuitable things before breakfast, and I like round numbers.
He almost smiled. The question stayed behind my teeth. Lord Vane watched us from the dining room window, his silver-threaded glove resting against the glass. That was the first trap, though I did not see the teeth close until Foxgate Wood. Chapter 4, The Ride at Foxgate Wood. Lord Vane called it a formal ride. I counted the hounds, the gloves, the extra men, and believed none of it.
A little instruction before marriage.
He said in the courtyard, adjusting his gloves.
A husband must understand his wife's habits.
I have so many. You will need a ledger.
I prefer demonstration.
Lady Wisseld stood on the steps in pale lavender, her fan closed tight in one hand. The house behind her looked damp and ashamed. Corvin hovered near Lord Vane's groom, saying nothing with the nervous industry of a man who had already said too much somewhere else. When Lord Vane's route map was folded away, I saw the damp edge of it in Corvin's hand for one moment before he tucked it behind his sleeve. Estate business, I decided, because I was still sentimental enough to dress cowardice in a clerk's coat. Kellen tightened Ashmane's girth. His face gave away nothing.
Not too near Foxgate,
he said quietly. Corvin's gaze jumped to the woods and away, too fast, too late. Lord Vane turned.
Does the stable advise on family rides now?
Kellen bowed.
Only on roads that lame horses.
How fortunate we are to have your concern.
I mounted before Kellen could say anything else.
Do come, my lord. I would hate to deprive you of a chance to be disappointed outdoors.
Kellen's hand brushed Ashmane's neck. The mare's ears flicked back toward him, then toward me. I felt the warning through her body. Not fear, refusal waiting to happen. So naturally, when we reached the edge of Foxgate Wood, I rode ahead, partly to insult Lord Vane, partly to prove I could still choose a direction no one had prepared, mostly because I could feel every man's gaze arranging me, and speed was the only reply that did not sound like pleading. Rain began at the tree line, gray and fine. Foxgate Wood smelled of wet leaves, old stone, and the mineral cold of the broken chapel bridge. As children, we had dared one another to cross it. Most of us had lied afterward. I remembered damp bread in my skirt pocket. I remembered a small sound under the arch. The reason for the tightness in my ribs stayed just out of reach. Ashmane stopped before the bridge. Lord Vane rode up behind me.
Trouble with discipline.
Ashmane backed away from his outstretched hand, so violently that my teeth clicked. Then the hounds began to bay. Not at me, at the trees. Men moved from the gray trunks with silver chains in their hands. The chains were thin, almost pretty, links flashing as they dragged over wet leaves. One man carried a pole with a loop at the end. Another held a hound so tightly, the animal choked on its own rage. The pieces came together too late. They had not ridden me into Foxgate to catch me. Lord Vane watched my face.
Call him.
I reached for the riding crop at my saddle. One of the men laughed.
Best call, lady. The stable dog hears when you breathe.
I did not scream. Kellen came anyway. He moved out of the trees so fast my mind tried to make him into weather. One moment there was rain and silver and hounds. The next, Kellen stood between Ashmain and the chains, shirt torn at the shoulder, blue eyes lit with something no candle had ever put there. He said one word. The hounds went flat to the mud. Not merely quiet. Flat. Bellies pressed into leaf rot, muzzled heads turned sideways, tails tucked so hard their haunches shook. One handler made a small choking sound.
They were blood-trained. They don't kneel to pray.
Lord Vane whispered a title I did not know.
Alpha.
Not loudly enough for me, loudly enough for every hound to tremble. Kellen's body shifted, not into the storybook beast from nursemaid's warnings. Not cleanly enough for art, but wrong enough for every sensible part of me to recoil. His shoulders drew broader under torn linen. His fingers lengthened around the wet air before settling back into hands I knew. His bones did not break. They obeyed a deeper shape. His hands caught one silver chain before it reached Ashmain. Smoke rose from his palm. He killed the man holding it with a movement too quick for my eyes to follow, and when the second man lunged, Kellen was already there. I dropped the riding crop in the mud. The last chain struck him across the side. His shirt tore open beneath his ribs. There, pale against olive skin, was an old scar. The bridge came back. I was 12 again, muddy to the elbows, hiding beneath broken stone with bread stolen from the kitchen, and my best dress torn into strips. A wolf pup had crawled into the shadows, shivering, one side wet with blood. Its eyes had been blue. I had been very brave until it whimpered. Then I had cried so hard I hiccuped while tying the strip around its ribs.
"Don't bite me,"
I had whispered.
"I am having an important charitable moment."
It had licked my wrist. I had returned 3 nights with bread, water, and pieces of my dresses. On the 4th night it was gone. I told myself it had lived because that was the only ending I could bear. Now Kellen stood in the rain with that same scar under his ribs, and I could still feel the wet bread breaking in my 12-year-old fingers. Lord Vane's face had gone bright with triumph.
The missing heir lives in a stable. How touching.
Kellen did not look at him. He looked at me.
Honoria,
he said. I slid from Ashmain's saddle. My boots hit mud. The hounds trembled against the ground. Silver smoke curled from his burned hand.
"Tell me,"
I said because my voice could manage anger better than grief.
"that you are still you."
His mouth tightened.
That was the lie.
The rain made a small clicking sound on the fallen silver chain. I should have run to the hunter. I should have run from both of them. Instead, I looked at the scar and thought of a wolf pup, licking crumbs from my palm under broken stone. If I named the wolf pup aloud, I was afraid I would forgive too much too quickly. I kept my mouth shut. Chapter 5, The Bridle Room, she locked from inside. Kellen brought me back through the stable yard by side paths I had thought only I knew. Of course he knew them. Kellen knew every route I had ever mistaken for mine. The house had gone tense with rumor by the time we reached the bridal room. Lord Vane had returned ahead of us, no doubt arranging witnesses, silver, procedure, all the pretty words men use when they want violence to look civilized. My mother sent twice for me. I ignored both messages. Kellen tried to leave me at the tack room door. I caught his neckcloth. He stopped at once. That angered me more than if he had fought. He could kill a man under rain before I managed a breath, but one tug from my dirty hand, and he became still.
"Inside.
Honoria.
Do not use my name like a gate latch. Inside."
I dragged him into the bridal room and locked the door myself. The brass key hung from his belt. I took it before he could decide whether I was safe enough to have it. Rain struck the small window. Leather straps hung from the walls, dark and orderly. The bent bridle hook remained where he had left it, warped metal catching lantern light, like a confession I had stepped around too long. Kellen stood with his back to the door. Blood darkened his sleeve. Silver had burned his palm raw. His shirt gaped where the chain had torn it, scar visible when he breathed.
"How long?"
Since the bridge.
Answer with real answers, dammit.
That will not become worse in the telling.
I laughed once. It came out ugly.
You were the wolf pup. You were the stable boy. You are whatever Lord Vane thinks he has caught. Anything else? A prince? A saint? The lost king of saddle soap?
His eyes flicked to my mouth and away.
Not a saint.
No. I gathered that from the bodies.
Leather creaked on its hooks. Neither of us looked away quickly enough. He looked down first, the way he did when someone with a title entered a room. I hated seeing it there, after everything in Foxgate.
Don't.
Don't what?
Look at the floor. Not with me.
His hand flexed, then closed around nothing. I stepped into him and pulled the neckcloth loose. Some kisses waited a threshold. Mine crossed it with muddy boots. Mine was anger with teeth, because fear would have made me step back, and I could not bear to give him the room. I kissed him before I could ask another question and hear another true thing sharpened like a knife. For one heartbeat, he did not move. Then the servant mask broke. He backed me against the bridal room door with a force he had spent years keeping out of his hands. The wood struck my shoulder blades. Bridles swayed on their hooks. His mouth was rough because mine had been. His unburned hand caught the door beside my head instead of closing where it could have held me still. The restraint of it made me shake. He loosened the torn lacing at my shoulder, fingers sure, breath hard against my cheek. When his burned hand brushed my sleeve, I flinched at the blood, not at him. He stopped so quickly it frightened me. There he was again, choosing not to use all his strength. Once, that had made me feel safe. Now it showed me how much strength had been waiting under safety all along.
No.
I said before he could retreat into decency.
Do not make that face.
What face?
The one where you pretend I am made of glass. You lied with better posture than everyone else, but they are all lies.
I do not know what to say.
Bastard.
His laugh was a single breath, almost pained. I pressed the brass key into his palm. His fingers closed around it by reflex. The brass bit into his burned palm. My hand kept it there.
Don't turn away. Not after following me for 11 years.
His eyes lifted to mine.
I don't want you to believe that anymore.
Good, I thought, and hated myself a little for it. I pulled him back. The bridal room narrowed to rain, leather, lantern smoke, and the hard shape of him trying and failing to remain only what I had known. Clothing loosened under impatient hands. My ribbon tore completely free. His neckcloth pin snapped somewhere beneath the saddle rack. Every time he paused, I answered with another deliberate touch, another refusal to let fear decide for me. His hands braced beside me until I caught one and put it at my waist. He said my name once, like warning. I kissed it out of his mouth. Afterward, the room looked like it had been searched by thieves with very specific interests. Straw dragged across stone, rainwater under the door, a snapped pin beneath the rack, my torn ribbon tied around his wrist because I had put it there, though I could not have explained why without sounding exactly as foolish as I felt. In the morning, I could not joke over the horses. That was how everyone knew something was wrong. Kellen overcorrected into servant distance so sharply even Master Pharaoh looked up from a hoofpick. Mabel saw the ribbon at his wrist and nearly dropped a folded cloth. I lied before she could speak.
Ashmain ate the rest of my bodice,
I said. Kellen's mouth twitched, then stopped.
Your horse,
Mabel said carefully.
ate only the ribbon?
She has a refined palate.
The lie was terrible. Kellen would have given it a gardener, a fallen hinge, 2 unrelated witnesses, and a weather pattern. Mine limped into the yard and died in public. Lord Vane stood by the stable entrance with his hounds. The hounds would not cross the bridal room threshold. He looked from my torn dress to Kellen's wrist, then to the blood-dark wound at Kellen's side, and the fact that neither of us could look at the other without looking away too late. He smiled as if I had handed him a map. Chapter 6. The grain loft, where he put the ladder back. After Foxgate, Brackenholt grew quieter in ways no house should. The servant who carried Lord Vane's messages stopped appearing in corridors. Corvin stopped making needling remarks at breakfast and began moving with the white, careful face of someone who had learned how heavy a man could be when dragged out of bed by the collar. Certain doors locked before I reached them. Others opened before I touched the handle. Kellen was always near, not beside me, not obviously. He was too clever for obvious. He stood at the end of corridors mending a rein that was not broken. He crossed the courtyard as I crossed the gallery. He appeared in the stable when I thought of Ashmain, and in the orchard when I thought of running. Once I had been glad to find him nearby. Now I looked for the places he had been before I arrived. When Lord Vane's men punished Jory again for failing to know which messages had gone missing, I found the young groom behind the feed shed with his wrist wrapped in a rag, and his face turned away so I would not see him cry. That did more than fear ever could. I found Kellen in the west stall, tying a rope with perfect, maddening care.
Jory can barely hold a brush,
I said. He did not turn.
Where is he hurt?
Wrist, face, pride, if he has any left after apologizing for being beaten.
His hands paused on the rope.
Jory should not have been touched.
Tell that to his wrist.
He looked at me then. The blue of his eyes was calmer than I wanted.
Vane uses weak points.
So do you.
That reached him. For half a second, the stable held only rain ticking against the roof, and Ashmain shifting in her stall. Then Kellen said too softly,
You think I don't know?
I had come ready to fight. That left me with nothing clean to strike. Before I found an answer, Master Pharaoh appeared in the passage with a sealed scrap of paper curling in his fist. Smoke smudged his sleeve.
Burned one already. This came with it.
Kellen went still. Pharaoh's gaze flicked to me and away.
Addressed to a name she doesn't know.
Then don't teach it to her,
Kellen said. Pharaoh's weathered face hardened.
Boy, I've let a great many things past because horses are alive and nobles are fools. But she's not a mare to be shut in when you smell trouble.
Kellen's jaw tightened.
Go inside, Honoria.
He said. I folded my arms.
No.
Please.
That was worse. Kellen rarely spent a please unless blood was already on the floor. The Wolfborn came that night. Ashmain knew before I did. Her head lifted from the stall door, ears pinned flat, and then every horse in the stable stopped chewing as one. Even the rain seemed to lower its voice. Only 3 figures moved through orchard shadow, wearing travel-stained wool, bone ties, leather bracers, and old anger. That was worse than an army. It felt personal enough to know my name. The largest of them had amber eyes and a carved bone clasp at his throat. He looked at Kellen and said a name I had never heard.
Aaron.
Kellen's face shut. I was in the loft before I understood he had moved me. One moment I stood near Ashmain's stall with rain on my sleeves and anger in my teeth. The next, Kellen's arm was around my waist, my boots left the ground, and the stable turned below me as he climbed the ladder with impossible speed. He set me in the grain loft.
Stay here.
I beg your pardon?
He was already going down. Then the ladder scraped, away. I stared at the empty square of floor where it had been. Beside me lay bread, a flask of water, and a knife placed carefully on a folded sack. Across the loft, a small hay door opened toward the yard. The drop beneath it was survivable if I was lucky, humiliating if I wasn't, and deadly if panic made me stupid. That was when I understood the insult. Kellen had left me a way out. He knew I climbed. He knew I would measure beams, knots, distances, wet wood. He had also left me a drop high enough to make me picture my bones badly set. Below, voices cut through rain.
She is not home.
The amber-eyed man said.
She is a leash dressed as a woman.
Kellen answered so quietly I had to crawl to the edge to hear.
Leave. Kill her, and you remember yourself.
Something struck wood hard enough to make dust fall from the beams. I shouted.
Kidnapping is a terrible courtship habit, Kellen.
The silence below was brief and appalled. Then Kellen said,
You rejected every polite method I could stomach.
I might have laughed if I had not been considering throwing the bread at his head with lethal intent. The Wolfborn withdrew before dawn. Not gone, Not defeated, only delayed. Kellen returned with blood on his shirt and rain in his hair. He climbed the wall without the ladder because apparently ladders were for people with ordinary skeletons. When he reached the loft, I stood with the knife in hand. His eyes dropped to it.
Good.
Do not praise me for using the utensil provided by my captor.
Honoria.
Put it back.
He looked at the empty loft opening.
If I do, you'll run.
Then you'll finally know the difference.
For a moment, I thought he might refuse. His fear had gone quiet and useful. That frightened me more than anger would have. Then he climbed down. The ladder returned with a scrape that sounded like a bone being set. He placed it properly, unlocked the stable door, and stepped away from the exit. Rain blew in across the threshold. The yard beyond was black and silvered with puddles. I climbed down slowly because fury has dignity until the second rung, where my wet boot slipped and I nearly ruined the moment by dying sideways. Kellen moved, stopped, let me catch myself. Good. I hated him for learning quickly. When my boots hit the stable floor, I struck him in the chest with both hands. He let me.
Stop choosing my dangers for me.
His mouth tightened.
You choose the ones that look like open fields, so no.
And you choose the ones that look like locked doors. Neither of us is charming.
He caught my wrist when I shoved him again. Not hard enough to hurt, easily enough to remind me what easily meant. My pulse jumped with anger and something worse.
Do not make another performance.
He released me at once. I walked to the open stable door and put one boot into the rain. Kellen did not block me. That should have made leaving simple. It did not. The road beyond the stable led to darkness. Vane's men, wolf-born kin, and a house that had already priced me. Behind me stood the man who had trapped me to keep me alive, and then put the ladder back because I demanded it. Neither choice was clean. Clean choices belonged to women in stories who had better families and fewer mudstains. Kellen's voice came from behind me.
Go.
Not a command, not quite a plea. I stepped back from the rain. He closed his eyes, and the flinch of it was worse than if I'd walked out. I took his shirt in both fists and pulled him down. This time I knew why I reached for him. That made it worse. When he tried to angle me backward, I drove him toward the grain sacks instead. Not because my strength meant anything against his. He let me choose the first step, and I hated how carefully he did it. When I looked toward the open door, he took his hands from me and held them where I could see them. His hands shook when I put them at my waist. Mine shook when I did not move them away. The lamp overturned but did not break. Grain spilled under our boots. Rain crossed the floor in a thin, shining line from the open door. The knife remained upstairs beside the bread. The restored ladder stood unused. Afterward, my hair was full of straw, his shirt was open, and neither of us looked at the door for a long while. Later, I called it strategy. Lying sounded better once I gave it a neat name. Chapter 7, The Bone Tie Buried Under Straw. Roran Moonridge returned before the sun cleared the orchard. His name meant nothing to me when he stepped through the stable door. I knew only that Ashmani pinned her ears before I heard his boots, and that Kellen moved from sleep to violence without crossing the space between. Roran stood with two wolfborn behind him, rain on his shoulders, amber eyes fixed on Kellen. His carved bone tie gleamed pale against his throat.
Barry,
he said again. I hated the way the name fit in the room. It fit with the intimacy of a hand reaching under Kellen's shirt to press on the scar. Kellen placed himself between us.
You were told to leave.
By a stable servant, or by the heir who let his brother wear silver for him.
The room changed. Even the horses went still. One of the wolfborn behind Roran lowered his eyes before he seemed to know he had done it. Roran saw, and hatred pinched his mouth tight. Kellen did not move, but I felt something in him tear. Roran saw it and reached for the bone tie at his throat. His fingers shook once before he hid them in the carved beads. The wolfborn at his left had a pale ring scar low on his neck, half hidden by his collar, and when Roran said the next name, that man looked at the floor.
Tavin wore the collar meant for you. 6 months. Skin gone under the hinge. fever every time they tightened it. But you were here, weren't you? Brushing her mare, carrying her mud, wearing a human name because a girl with torn dresses fed you bread under a bridge.
My hands went cold. The scar under Kellen's ribs looked different now. I pictured iron against someone else's skin, fever, and a hinge tightened in his place.
Do not say his name in front of her,
Kellen said. His voice dropped until the words were almost hard to hear. The wolf-born with the collar scar stepped back half a pace, then bared his teeth at his own obedience. Roran smiled.
There he is.
One of the wolf-born moved toward Ashmane's stall. The mare struck the door hard enough to rattle the hinges. Jory, pale and bruised, appeared in the far passage with a lantern he should have dropped and run from. Roran's gaze flicked to him, then to me.
Still collecting weak things, Aaron.
I stepped between the stall and the fight, because Ashmane would have broken her leg trying to kick through the door, and Jory looked ready to apologize to his own murderer.
Don't touch the horse,
I said. Roran stared at me as if I had no right to enter the quarrel.
Ridiculous. Just fed like a common mutt. After that, he stopped coming back to us? Foolish.
I should have denied it. I should have said I was a child and he was a pup, and none of us knew what kindness would cost. Kellen moved before I spoke. There was no glory in the fight. Bodies struck wood too close to me. Hooves hammered stall doors. Horses opened their mouths on soundless panic. Silver flashed once and burned Kellen's forearm. Roran slammed him against the stall post hard enough to crack old timber. Kellen's eyes went bright, and for a second the man I knew was not gone, but stretched thin over something with older rules. Master Pharaoh appeared in the shadowed passage. He took Jory by the collar and dragged him back, not gently. Mabel's pale face showed behind him, then vanished. I do not know exactly when Roran lost. I know when the stable went quiet. Kellen stood by the open rear door, breathing hard, blood running from his wrist into his palm. The two wolf-born were gone into the orchard rain. Roran was beyond the threshold, half in mud, one hand clawed in the grass. Kellen looked at me once, not asking forgiveness. He knew better. Then he followed Roran into the trees. When he returned, the carved bone tie was gone from Roran's throat. I found it later near the orchard fence, trampled into the mud. Pale bone beads, one cracked, threaded with dark cord. Blood had dried in the carving. Master Pharaoh stood under the apple tree watching.
Best leave that,
he said. I crouched and picked it up. The mud sucked at my ruined boot. My fingers shook, which annoyed me. I had climbed fences with less shaking after falling out of windows.
Lady Honoria.
I saw nothing useful,
I said. Pharaoh's expression did not change. I carried the bone tie back to the stable and buried it under fresh straw behind the old grain bin. Ashmane lowered her head over the stall door and breathed against my shoulder. I covered it until no pale bead showed. No one told me to do it. Chapter 8, The Chapel Flowers Sewn with Silver. Lady Isolde moved the wedding forward by 3 days. This was her answer to missing servants, injured men, claw marks on stable wood, hounds refusing thresholds, and her daughter returning from the orchard with blood under her fingernails. At breakfast, she announced the new date, as if moving ruin earlier made it tidier.
The settlement cannot wait,
she said. I looked at her keys. They hung from her chatelaine in a neat, bright cluster. The stable key was not there. Kellen had it again. Kellen always had it until someone took it, and even then he seemed to know where it had gone.
Settlements are famously delicate, like soufflés or corpses.
Corvin dropped his eyes to his plate. He had not met my gaze since Kellen dragged him from his room and taught him whatever lesson left a man alive but careful. I should have pitied him more. Some part of me did. The rest was busy wondering how many small truths he had sold before fear made him quiet. Lady Isolde's fan snapped shut.
Enough.
No, it has not been nearly enough. That is the difficulty.
Her mouth trembled, only once. If I had not known her face so well, I would have missed it. She came to my room that afternoon while Mabel fitted the bridal dress. White silk swallowed me from shoulder to ankle, pinned so carefully that my body seemed to belong to the gown instead of the other way around. My hair resisted the veil, pins scraped along my scalp and trapped the short, straight pieces against my temples. Mabel's fingers were bandaged.
The flowers?
I asked. Her eyes flicked to Lady Isolde, then down.
Wire inside the stems, my lady, to hold the arch.
Silver wire, fine enough to hide, sharp enough to cut skin. Lady Isolde dismissed her. When we were alone, my mother stood behind me in the mirror, iron gray hair pinned tight, pale face powdered smooth, hands clasped so hard the rings left marks.
There is still time,
I said. Her eyes met mine in the glass. For 1 second, she looked like a woman instead of a house wearing pearls. She reached into the pocket of her gown and drew out a brass key. My throat closed. The stable key lay in her palm. Kellen must have let it be taken, or placed it where she could find it. Either possibility made my stomach twist. Lady Isolde looked at the key, then at me.
The east postern, past the laundry yard, if one left before dusk.
If one, not if you. Her hand shook, then bells rang in the lower hall. Lord Vane's men arriving, debt carriages on the drive, witnesses, procedure. Her fingers closed around the key.
It is too late,
she said. I laughed, very softly.
No, it is merely inconvenient. You have always confused the two.
She slapped me, not hard. Her rings scratched my cheek. Her hand shook afterward. I took the riding crop from beneath my folded cloak while she looked away. The small hooked end had caught too many orchard branches to be elegant. I slid it under the wedding skirt, along my thigh, hidden in silk. By the time I entered the chapel, I knew it was bait. Refusing would not save me. It would only give Lord Vane permission to move openly against Mabel, Jory, Pharaoh, anyone who had seen too much and mattered too little. Brackenholt's chapel smelled of wet stone, candle smoke, and white flowers arranged over old rot. The flowers were beautiful first, which made the trap worse. Ivory petals, pale ribbons. Silver thread worked through the stems like frost in a seam. Mabel stood near the arch with red spots on her apron where the wire had cut through her bandages. Jory held a lantern near the vestibule. His wrist was wrapped again. His eyes found mine and dropped. Lord Vane waited at the front in pearl gray, silver gloves immaculate. His hounds strained in muzzles near the doors. My mother stood beside the first pew, one hand closed around nothing now, or so I thought. Her knuckles were tucked into the fold of her skirt, white and tight. Corvin would not look at me. He looked at the flower arch instead, then flinched before Lord Vane had even raised his hand. Lord Vane leaned close as I reached him.
After the vows,
I will chain every wolf-born thing you have ever pitied, beginning with the stable boy you failed to hide.
Romantic. No one told me there would be hobbies.
His smile stayed fixed.
I was promised a bride, not a handler for strays.
The chapel doors opened before I found my next insult. Kellen walked in. He wore no coat, no disguise grander than the same open-collared linen and fitted waistcoat he had worn in the stables. The torn ribbon remained at his wrist. Silver burns marked the skin where his sleeve failed to hide them. His eyes found mine, then moved over the chapel, counting. Flowers, ribbons, hounds, men, exits. He had come willingly. Of course he had. Every trap in my life had learned its easiest bait. Put me inside, and Kellen would cross the threshold before I called. Lord Vane raised one gloved hand. Silver wire snapped tight from the flower arch. In the same breath, the brass key slipped from my mother's hidden fist and rang once against chapel stone before vanishing under fallen petals. Kellen saw it too late to avoid all of it. The line tore across his side and shoulder. Smoke rose where it touched him. His knees struck chapel stone hard enough that the sound went through me. The hounds lunged against their muzzles, choking on the scent of blood and silver.
Take her alive,
Lord Vane said. One of his men moved toward me. Another went for Jory. I went for the second man first. I broke from the wedding line. A bridesmaid screamed. It may have been my cousin's wife. I had never liked her voice. My hand found the crop beneath my skirt. The first man, reaching for my veil, took the hooked end across his face and went down with an astonished grunt.
Terribly sorry,
I said, breathless.
Bridal nerves.
Jory froze as the second handler reached for him. I grabbed the silver-edged ribbon I had marked near the flower arch, the wrong ribbon, the useful ribbon, and hooked it with the crop. The wire cut into the leather. I pulled with both hands. For one horrible second, nothing gave. Then the arch snapped. White flowers burst across the aisle. Silver wire whipped loose, tearing petals, cutting my glove, slackening around Kellen's side. The hounds, trained to blood and silver and fear, turned toward the sudden scatter of scent on Lord Vane's boots. One handler shouted a command. The hounds ignored him. Kellen lifted his head, still on one knee, smoke rising from his side. He gave a sound too low to be speech and too deliberate to be pain. The hounds froze. Every muzzle swung toward him. Then slowly they lowered as if the chapel floor had become mud beneath his word. Lord Vane looked down. For the first time, calculation failed to hide recognition. Kellen moved, not with rage. That would have been easier to forgive or condemn. He moved with brutal control, the kind that has already chosen every step long before the music begins. I had given him slack. He used it. Lord Vane drew his silver-edged blade. Kellen caught his wrist, burned for touching the glove, and turned the knife with a precision that made Lord Vane's eyes widen for the first time since I had met him. They struck the vestibule wall. A candle fell. Hounds thrashed. Someone prayed in a whisper that sounded like begging the wrong room. When it ended, Lord Vane lay among crushed flowers, one silver glove dark at the wrist. His other hand pressed uselessly at his throat, where his fine collar had opened red. Kellen stood over him, breathing hard, blood dripping from his side onto white petals. No one cheered. My mother stared at the crushed flowers. Corvin looked sick. Mabel kept both bandaged hands over her mouth. Kellen looked at the room, at the servants, at my mother, at the body, and I saw the old habit rise in him, the ridiculous cover story, the lie with weather and hinges, and some dead gardener accused of impossible labor.
The Hounds,
he began. I did not help him. The words died. It hurt more than I expected, losing that little piece of us. The part where he lied and I laughed and everyone else was foolish enough to believe. It had been childish. It had also been warm. I looked down at Lord Vane and said, because shock makes me appalling.
At least I don't have to dance with him.
Kellen laughed once. It came out short and wrong, and he looked ashamed of it at once. Lady Iseld reached for me.
Honoria,
she said, not command, not quite.
Come back to the house.
Her hand stopped halfway, as it always had. I stepped over crushed silver-threaded flowers. Bridal silk dragged through rainwater blown in from the vestibule. One white footprint landed in blood. At the vestibule, Kellen stopped once. The brass key lay under petals near my mother's shoe, bright with rainwater and candle wax. He picked it up without hiding it, without looking at me as if recovery were absolution, and held it loose at his side. I chose the stable path. Chapter 9, the stable key left in the straw. Kellen did not touch me on the way back. On the walk back, restraint sat in his body like an injury. I could feel him wanting to steer me around puddles, around fallen branches, around the fresh wolf tracks pressed into mud beyond the chapel wall. He kept his hands to himself. Rain flattened my veil. My short hair escaped its pins and stuck to my jaw. The bridal silk grew heavier with every step. Behind us, Brackenholt breathed in panic and calculation. Ahead, the old stable waited with its lantern light and wet wood, and the smell of straw, horse sweat, and every free thing I had ever mistaken for simple. Master Pharaoh stood in the outer dark when we arrived. His eyes moved over Kellen's burned side, my torn skirt, the blood on both our hands. He looked at the door. He looked at Kellen. Kellen stepped aside from the threshold. Pharaoh's weathered face changed almost not at all. Almost. He turned and walked back into the rain without a word. Inside, Ashmain lifted her head and gave one low, questioning sound. I pressed my fingers to her white star. She smelled of hay and storm. She did not forgive men. She only recognized them. Kellen took the brass stable key from his belt. Petal dust still clung to the grooves. For a moment, I thought he would hand it to me. He laid it in the straw instead, halfway between us, where no palm could hide it and no apology could soften it. His shirt clung to his skin. Silver burns marked him in angry lines. The ribbon at his wrist was dark with rain and blood. He stood far enough from the door that I could have walked past him without brushing his sleeve.
Road. House. Empty chapel. Me.
There were 100 questions I could have asked. How many men had he frightened away before I met them? How many doors had opened because he unlocked them first? How many times had I laughed at luck while he stood in the weather, arranging the shape of my escape? I asked none of them. I looked around, in the torn ribbon at his wrist, in the bent hook in the bridal room, in the ladder he had removed and restored, in Jory's wrapped wrist, in Mabel's bandaged fingers, in Corvin's frightened silence, in the place behind the grain bin where straw hid Roran's bone tie because my own hands had put it there, in Lord Vane's blood cooling among flowers that had been beautiful before they cut. Kellen looked at me, and every unsaid thing seemed to settle on his shoulders.
I never wanted to be Alpha,
he said. The word sounded strange in the stable, too large, too polished by other people's wanting.
No. You wanted to be a stable boy with suspiciously clean timing. Very modest.
His mouth moved, not quite a smile.
I wanted to stay.
That was more dangerous than a confession. Confessions ask to be answered. This simply stood there, bleeding.
I was 12. I fed a wolf pup bread and tied up a wound with my best dress. It was not meant to go this far. I thought you just went home after.
I get.
The words opened something in me I had been holding shut since Foxgate. He looked at the key.
You were home.
I hated him a little for saying it plainly. I hated myself more for wanting to keep it.
And service? Was that home too? Saddling horses, carrying lies, waiting at doors?
His blue eyes lifted.
It was the only place you let me stand.
The stable went very quiet. No apology followed. No better word came to make it smaller. My laugh came out thin.
That may be the least suitable thing anyone has ever said to a bride.
I know.
Do you?
His eyes held mine.
More than I did when I started.
There was no apology. I almost wanted one so I could reject it. Instead, he gave me the worst thing, room. The key lay in the straw. The door behind him remained unblocked. Rain ran beneath the threshold in a silver-gray line. Outside, wolf tracks filled slowly with water. I thought of my mother closing her hand around the key, Lord Vane touching my hair with clean gloves, Mr. Crow pricing my temper, Corvin selling my habits because someone had finally made resentment useful. Then I looked at what Kellen had done. A saddled mare beneath an apple tree, a lie about a dead gardener, a hand that caught me before I fell and let go at once, blood scrubbed from cuffs, a ladder put back because I told him to, a key placed where I could see it. The key lay where he had put it. The door stood open. He waited to see which one I would use. I stepped toward the key. Kellen did not move. That was the closest he came to pleading. I put my bare foot beside the brass and pressed it farther into the straw away from the door. His breath changed.
Honoria.
Do not make that my warning name. I am very tired of being warned by men who made the danger.
I reached behind my neck and pulled free the last veil pin. The remaining scrap of bridal silk slid from my shoulder and fell beside the key. My hair, damp and uneven, brushed my jaw. Mud streaked one ankle. Blood dried under my fingernails. Kellen's hand stayed at his sides, so I took the blood-streaked one and placed it on my waist. I did not wipe the blood away before I put his hand there. I needed both of us to notice that. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the blue had gone almost painful. He sank to one knee first. His forehead touched the torn silk at my hip. His burned hand trembled once against me.
The door is still open,
he said, voice rough. I took his shirt in both fists and pulled him up.
I know.
The kiss after that had no interest in gentleness. It settled nothing. I closed that door with my own hand, while the key remained visible on the floor. His hand braced against the stable wall above my shoulder. Mine slid over burned skin and did not flinch. Silk loosened and fell into straw piece by piece, until the gown no longer looked bridal. Once my gaze went to the door. Kellen felt it and opened his hand against the wall, giving the space back without stepping away. I looked back at him and pulled his mouth to mine again. Later, rain softened to a whisper against the roof. The lantern burned low. My wedding silk lay abandoned in the straw, caught under my heel. The brass key remained where I had pushed it, unused, and shining faintly through loose hay. Outside the closed stable door, fresh wolf tracks darkened the rain-soaked mud.
I hope I kept you company with my story. It would mean so much for you to like and subscribe because it helps me make more. I'll see you in the next one.